The sand does not give up its secrets willingly. In the autumn of 1952, a British geological survey team working the remote Rub al-Khali, the vast, uninhabited quarter of the Arabian Peninsula that locals call the Empty Quarter, recorded something in their field notes that would quietly vanish from every subsequent official report. Beneath their ground-penetrating instruments, at a depth of nearly 4 meters below compacted desert floor, their readings returned the unmistakable signature of organized geometric structure. Not rock formations, not natural sediment layering, straight lines, right angles, the subterranean shadow of walls. The lead geologist, a man named Edmund Hargreaves, reportedly sat with his instruments for 3 hours, recalibrating, rerunning the sequence. The readings did not change. Beneath one of the most hostile, lifeless environments on Earth, a desert so brutal that even seasoned Bedouin navigators avoid its heart, something had been built, something vast. The report filed to London made no mention of the anomaly. Hargreaves' personal journal, recovered by his daughter in 1987 and never formally published, contains a single-line entry dated November 14, 1952. "There is a city beneath us. I do not know what to do with that." He would never return to the site. The coordinates were never formally logged. Decades later, satellite imaging technology would begin to peel back the surface of the world's great deserts. And what it found beneath the sands of the Arabian Peninsula, the Sahara, and the Gobi would force a quiet, deeply uncomfortable conversation among a small circle of archaeologists and geologists who understood exactly what they were looking at. Not scattered ruins, not isolated temples, cities. Grid-planned, hydraulically engineered, monumentally constructed cities, predating every civilization in the accepted historical record by thousands of years. The accepted story of human history begins, we are told, around 3500 BCE, the rise of Sumer, the first cities, the first writing, organized human civilization. According to every textbook on every shelf in every institution of learning on Earth, is approximately 5,500 years old. But what lies beneath the desert silence is not 5,000 years old. The question is not merely what was buried here. The question is, who decided it should stay buried, and why? Every civilization, we are told, has a beginning. The story Western academia has constructed, refined over 2 centuries of excavation, carbon dating, and institutional consensus, places the birth of organized human society in a precise geographic and temporal window. Mesopotamia, roughly 3500 BCE, the Fertile Crescent, that curved band of irrigable land stretching between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is presented as the cradle, the first city, the first written language, the first wheel, the first evidence that human beings had transcended nomadic survival and begun, deliberately and collectively, to build something permanent. From Sumer emerged Akkad. From Akkad, Babylon. The timeline extends forward from that anchor point, with confidence and institutional authority, cross-referenced by stratigraphy, corroborated by cuneiform tablets, validated by generations of peer-reviewed scholarship. It is a story with the weight of consensus behind it, and consensus, in archaeology, carries enormous power. The approved model holds that prior to 3500 BCE, human beings existed in small, scattered, subsistence-level communities, hunter-gatherers, pastoral nomads following seasonal grazing patterns, perhaps early agricultural settlements, but nothing resembling urban infrastructure, nothing resembling city planning, hydraulic engineering, or monumental architecture. The cognitive and organizational capacity for such achievement, the mainstream position argues, had simply not yet emerged. This is the framework taught in universities, printed in textbooks, defended in academic journals, and it rests, almost entirely, on what has been excavated, on the assumption that what has been found represents the totality of what existed. That assumption, as we shall see, is precisely where the entire edifice begins to crack, because the desert was never fully excavated. It was, in key instances, deliberately left alone. Every civilization, we are told, has a beginning. The story Western academia has constructed, refined over 2 centuries of excavation, carbon dating, and institutional consensus, places the birth of organized human society in a precise geographic and temporal window. Mesopotamia, roughly 3500 BCE, the Fertile Crescent, that curved band of irrigable land stretching between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is presented as the cradle, the first city, the first written language, the first wheel, the first evidence that human beings had transcended nomadic survival and begun, deliberately and collectively, to build something permanent. From Sumer emerged Akkad. From Akkad, Babylon. The timeline extends forward from that anchor point, with confidence and institutional authority. Cross-referenced by stratigraphy, corroborated by cuneiform tablets, validated by generations of peer-reviewed scholarship. It is a story with the weight of consensus behind it, and consensus in archaeology carries enormous power. The approved model holds that prior to 3500 BCE, human beings existed in small, scattered, subsistence-level communities. Hunter-gatherers, pastoral nomads following seasonal grazing patterns, perhaps early agricultural settlements, but nothing resembling urban infrastructure, nothing resembling city planning, hydraulic engineering, or monumental architecture. The cognitive and organizational capacity for such achievement, the mainstream position argues, had simply not yet emerged. This is the framework taught in universities, printed in textbooks, defended in academic journals, and it rests, almost entirely, on what has been excavated, on the assumption that what has been found represents the totality of what existed. That assumption, as we shall see, is precisely where the entire edifice begins to crack, because the desert was never fully excavated. It was, in key instances, deliberately left alone. The first fracture appears not in the desert, but in the data. In 2000, Boston University geologist Dr. Farouk Elbaz, a man whose credentials include directing NASA's Center for Remote Sensing Research, published findings from a multi-year satellite imaging study of the Arabian Peninsula. What his team identified beneath the surface sediment of the Rub al-Khali were the dried remnants of an ancient river network. Vast, branching, hydraulically significant waterways that had once carried sufficient volume to sustain large, permanent human populations. His conclusion was geologically unambiguous. The empty quarter was not always empty. 10,000 years ago, it was green, fertile, watered. The climate record corroborates this completely. Paleoclimatologists have established, with considerable precision, that the period between approximately 10,000 and 6,000 BCE, what scientists call the African Humid Period, or colloquially, the Green Sahara, saw radical transformation across the entire northern desert belt of the Old World. The Sahara bloomed, the Arabian interior filled with lakes and rivers. The Gobi's western reaches softened into grassland. These were not marginal improvements in habitability. They were conditions capable of sustaining dense, complex, sedentary civilization. And yet, according to the official narrative, no such civilization existed. Here is where the inconsistency becomes impossible to dismiss. If the land was fertile, watered, and climatically hospitable for 4,000 years, a span nearly equal to the entire recorded history of Western civilization, why does mainstream archaeology insist it stood empty? Why does the accepted timeline place organized urban life exclusively in Mesopotamia, when the geological record confirms that a vast, connected arc of habitable land stretched thousands of miles in every direction? The answer offered by institutional archaeology is silence, not refutation, not counter-evidence, silence. There is something else that fractures the official story, something more visceral than satellite data and climate modeling. In 2008, archaeologists working at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, a site that required a complete redating of organized human construction, uncovered megalithic pillars weighing between 10 and 20 tons, arranged with astronomical precision, decorated with sophisticated iconographic carving. The site dated conclusively to 9600 BCE, 11,500 years ago. The implications were seismic. Here was evidence of organized, large-scale, symbolically sophisticated human construction predating Sumer by 6,000 years. Göbekli Tepe did not fit the model. It did not emerge from the accepted developmental sequence. It appeared, fully formed, from a period when human beings were supposedly incapable of such coordination. The mainstream response was instructive. Göbekli Tepe was acknowledged, carefully quarantined as an anomaly, and the broader timeline was left fundamentally undisturbed. But anomalies, when they accumulate, cease to be anomalies. They become evidence. And beneath the desert floor of the Arabian Peninsula, the evidence is only beginning to surface. The evidence does not arrive as a single thunderclap revelation. It accumulates, site by site, survey by survey, in the margins of published reports and the footnotes of studies that drew entirely different official conclusions. To follow it requires patience, cross-disciplinary fluency, and a willingness to read what the data actually says, rather than what the accompanying interpretation insists it means. Begin with the satellite record. Between 2003 and 2011, a series of synthetic aperture radar imaging studies, the same subsurface penetration technology used by NASA to map planetary surfaces, were applied to the desert floors of the Arabian Peninsula and the Eastern Sahara. The technology, capable of reading geological structure up to 5 meters below compacted sand, was commissioned primarily for petroleum and aquifer surveying. Its findings in those specific applications were commercially useful. But in the margins of that data, visible to anyone with the training to interpret it, were geometric anomalies that had nothing to do with petroleum geology. Rectilinear structures, radial street patterns, the unmistakable subsurface signatures of organized construction on a civic scale. Dr. Eamon Ghanem of the University of North Carolina, working from this same radar imaging data, published findings in 2012, identifying a buried river system beneath the northeastern Sahara of sufficient scale to have supported, in her own published words, dense human habitation across a vast connected region. Her work was widely cited within hydrology. Its archaeological implications were almost universally ignored. She was not alone. In the early 1990s, a team of geologists working under contract for the Saudi Geological Survey documented, in an internal report later partially declassified, a series of subsurface structural anomalies concentrated in 3 distinct zones within the Rub al-Khali. The anomalies were flagged as geologically inconsistent with natural formation. The report recommended further investigation. No follow-up survey was ever commissioned. The coordinates of all 3 zones were redacted from the declassified version. The pattern of redaction is itself a form of evidence. Turn, then, to what has been physically excavated, because the desert has not kept every secret perfectly sealed. In 1992, a discovery in the southern reaches of Oman, at a site the Bedouin had long called Ubar, and which classical Arabic sources referenced as Iram of the Pillars, a city of legendary antiquity, produced the remains of a substantial urban settlement buried beneath the sand. Ground-penetrating radar, guided partly by NASA satellite imaging, located the site. What emerged from excavation was a fortified, hydraulically sophisticated settlement with architectural features suggesting occupation stretching back, at minimum, to 5000 BCE. The mainstream response classified it as a trading post with 8-foot-thick defensive towers. A trading post with a water management system of considerable engineering complexity. A trading post that, according to the geological record, had been deliberately buried, not by time and wind alone, but by the catastrophic collapse of the limestone cavern system beneath it, a collapse consistent with the rapid aquifer depletion that follows the end of a wet climatic period. Ubar did not fade, it was swallowed. And Ubar, the evidence increasingly suggests, was not exceptional, it was representative. Across the Fertile Crescent's outer desert margins, archaeologists working since the late 1990s have identified what they term ghost landscapes. The faint, radar-visible outlines of field systems, road networks, and settlement clusters that predate the earliest officially recognized occupation of those regions by millennia. In Syria's eastern desert, in Jordan's black basalt wilderness, in the gravel plains south of the Euphrates, the ghost landscapes persist, acknowledged in specialist literature, absent from public discourse, and entirely unreconciled with the accepted developmental timeline. There is also the matter of the water. Every large-scale urban civilization requires hydraulic infrastructure. The engineering of water, its collection, storage, distribution, and management, is not a secondary feature of city building. It is its precondition. And the subsurface imaging of the Arabian interior has revealed, with striking consistency, the remnants of precisely such infrastructure. Buried channels, cistern-scale depressions at regular intervals, and earthwork alignments that follow the contours of the ancient river systems, with a precision that is not accidental. These are not natural features. They are the bones of a water management system, enormous in scale, coherent in design, and old in a way that the accepted timeline has no framework to accommodate. The sand preserved what the institutions chose not to pursue, and what it preserved, taken in aggregate, does not describe scattered primitive habitation. It describes a civilization. The word cover-up carries uncomfortable connotations. It implies intention, coordination, a deliberate architecture of concealment sustained across institutions, across generations, across the ordinary human tendency toward disclosure. It is a claim that demands a higher burden of evidence than mere anomaly. And it is, for that reason, the claim that serious researchers approach most carefully. But there is a distinction that must be drawn, a distinction that changes everything. There is the cover-up of active suppression. Documents destroyed, artifacts disappeared, researchers discredited by coordinated institutional pressure. And there is the cover-up of structural neglect. The funding never allocated, the follow-up survey never commissioned, the anomalous finding quietly absorbed into a footnote and never pursued. The second form is less dramatic. It is also far more common, far more deniable, and in its cumulative effect equally total. What the evidence suggests, in the case of the buried cities of the desert belt, is primarily the second kind, though the first kind is not entirely absent. Consider the funding architecture of academic archaeology. Field excavation is expensive. Permits are politically negotiated. Publication requires institutional affiliation. Tenure depends on peer acceptance. The entire professional apparatus of mainstream archaeology is structured in a way that does not merely discourage paradigm-challenging research. It makes such research functionally impossible to sustain without independent financing and an acceptance of professional marginalization. Researchers who have pursued the subsurface anomalies of the Arabian Peninsula have, with notable consistency, found their grant applications declined, their findings published only in peripheral journals, and their careers quietly redirected. This is not conspiracy, it is institutional gravity. But institutional gravity has architects. The foundational framework of Near Eastern archaeology was constructed predominantly between 1880 and 1950, a period of intense colonial, archaeological activity in which British, French, and German expeditions simultaneously excavated the ancient world and defined the interpretive boundaries within which those excavations would be understood. The men who built those boundaries were not neutral scholars. They were products of an imperial epistemology that placed the origins of civilization firmly within a geographic and cultural frame that served specific political narratives, narratives of Western inheritance from a classical Near Eastern root, with nothing of consequence existing outside that lineage. A pre-Sumerian urban civilization spanning the desert belt of Arabia and the Sahara does not fit that narrative. It never did. The Vatican's role, while less direct than popular imagination tends to assume, is not negligible. The Church maintained for centuries a theological investment in a human timeline that began with creation and progressed toward redemption. A timeline incompatible with the deep human prehistory that desert archaeology now implies. While the Vatican's direct influence over secular archaeology has diminished considerably since the 19th century, the temporal assumptions embedded in that theological framework became the foundational assumptions of Western historical scholarship, long before the separation of church and academic institution was complete. Those assumptions were not neutral inheritances. They were parameters, and they held. Then there is the matter of the Saudi Geological Survey's redacted coordinates. 3 zones of structural anomaly within the Rub al-Khali, flagged in the 1990s and subsequently buried in bureaucratic obscurity. The Arabian Peninsula presents a particular political complexity for archaeological transparency. The region's modern national identities are constructed, in significant part, around Islamic historical frameworks that place the peninsula's significance in the relatively recent past. A pre-Islamic, pre-Abrahamic urban civilization of global significance existing beneath Saudi territory is not merely an academic inconvenience. It is a political crisis in waiting. The silence, in this context, does not require a shadowy global conspiracy. It requires only that every institution with a stake in the existing story, academic, governmental, theological, colonial, find the silence more convenient than the alternative, and they have. Assume for a moment that the evidence is correct. Assume that beneath the compacted silence of the world's great desert belts lie the remnants of a civilization, or a network of civilizations, that flourished between 10 and 7,000 years ago. That these were not scattered encampments of subsistence-level nomads, but planned urban settlements with hydraulic infrastructure, astronomical orientation, monumental architecture, and the organizational complexity that such features necessarily imply. Assume that this civilization collapsed not through conquest or internal failure, but through a climate, swallowed by the desertification that transformed the green Sahara and the fertile Arabian interior into the vast, hostile emptiness that exists today. What follows from that assumption is not a minor revision to the historical record. It is a complete reconstruction of the human story. The first and most immediate implication strikes at the very concept of civilization's origin. If organized urban life existed 4,000 to 5,000 years before Sumer, then Sumer was not a beginning. It was a renaissance, a partial, fragmented reconstruction of something that had already been achieved and lost. The knowledge systems that appear, seemingly fully formed, in the earliest Mesopotamian and Egyptian records, the astronomical precision, the mathematical frameworks, the hydraulic engineering principles, were not invented in the river valleys. They were carried there, preserved across generations of transmission, by the survivors of a world the desert consumed. This reframes every foundational mythology of the ancient world. The flood narratives, present in Sumerian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Hindu, and dozens of other ancient textual traditions, have long been treated by mainstream scholarship as either metaphorical constructs or localized folks' memories of regional flooding events. But if a large-scale civilization existed during the climatically hospitable period, before 6000 BCE, and if that civilization was destroyed by the rapid, catastrophic desertification that paleoclimatological records confirm occurred in precisely that window, then the flood narratives are not metaphor. They are memory, traumatic, cross-generational, obsessively preserved memory of a world that was lost. Not to water alone, perhaps, but to the total environmental collapse of the only world those people had ever known. The second implication is geographic and political in equal measure. If the cradle of the world's oldest urban civilization lies not in Mesopotamia, but beneath the sands of the Arabian Peninsula and the Eastern Sahara, regions that today comprise some of the most geopolitically sensitive territory on Earth, then the question of who controls that narrative carries consequences that extend far beyond academic debate. The history of a region is inseparable from the legitimacy claims of its present inhabitants. Archaeological priority is not merely scholarly currency. It is, in the modern world, a form of territorial and cultural capital. The third implication is the most profound and the most unsettling. It concerns the nature of human resilience and human forgetting. If a civilization of genuine sophistication and scale can be so completely erased by climate that 4,000 years of subsequent human history proceeded in apparent ignorance of its existence, then the question that follows is not merely historical. It is existential. How fragile is the archive of human achievement? How completely can knowledge, infrastructure, and collective memory be obliterated by environmental collapse? And if it happened once, thoroughly enough that only satellite radar and suppressed, geological surveys hint at what was lost. What assurance exists that it cannot happen again? The desert does not offer reassurance on this point. It offers only silence and the weight of what that silence contains. There is a particular quality to desert silence that has no equivalent elsewhere on Earth. It is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of compression, of time and heat and geological pressure bearing down on everything beneath, holding it in place, preserving it in a stillness so complete that the boundary between burial and erasure becomes difficult to locate. Stand at the edge of the Rub al Khali at dusk, when the light flattens and the sand takes on the color of old bone, and what you feel is not emptiness. What you feel is weight. Somewhere beneath your feet, beneath the compacted centuries of wind-driven sediment, beneath the dried ghost channels of rivers that ran full and vital 10 millennia ago. There are walls, there are streets, there are the geometric remains of a human world so thoroughly swallowed that the civilization which replaced it had no memory of its existence, only the faint, haunting echo of its knowledge, preserved in myth and architectural instinct, and the flood stories that every culture on Earth, without exception, felt compelled to record. Edmund Hargreaves sat with his instruments in the autumn of 1952 and wrote, "There is a city beneath us." He did not know what to do with that. Neither, it seems, did the institutions he reported to. Neither did the generations of archaeologists who followed, who looked at the anomalous data and chose the clean lines of the accepted timeline over the uncomfortable complexity of what the desert floor was quietly confessing. The question this leaves us with is not purely archaeological. It is a question about the nature of knowledge itself, about who constructs the boundaries of what is considered knowable, and what it costs across generations when those boundaries are drawn too tightly. Every framework has a perimeter. Every discipline has a horizon beyond which its practitioners are professionally discouraged from looking. The history of human civilization, as currently understood, has such a horizon, and it sits, with suspicious precision, just at the edge of the desert's reach. What lies beyond that horizon has not disappeared. It has waited. The satellite data will continue to accumulate. The ground-penetrating surveys, commissioned for petroleum and water and the ordinary industrial purposes of the modern world, will continue to return their geometric anomalies, their right angles and rectilinear patterns, and the unmistakable subsurface signatures of streets that no official history has yet named. At some point, the accumulation will reach a threshold that institutional silence can no longer absorb. At some point, the footnotes will demand to become the text. When that moment arrives, the history of human civilization will not require a minor revision. It will require a new beginning. And the desert, which has held its secret for 10,000 years, with the patience of something that does not experience time the way the living do, will have nothing left to say. It will have already said everything. In the geometry of buried walls, in the dried beds of vanished rivers, in the silence that was never, in the end, quite silent enough.